Welcome back. In this video, we are going to start applying the CSS box model in practice. And in particular, we are going to focus on two very important properties, margin and padding. We already learned that what these properties mean theoretically. Now it's time to actually use them to improve the design of our web page. So let's start with padding. If you look at this header, it has a background color. And whenever an element has a background color or a border, padding can be very useful, because padding creates space inside the element between the content and the outside edge of the element. So let's find our main header class. Here it is. Just I'm just copying this and keeping it in here. Now let's add a padding of 20 pixel. So, and immediately we can see that we have some additional space around the content. If you want to check, we can go for the inspect. We go for the main header. As you can see, the padding is 20. And this is nothing but height and width, and this is border, and this is margin. And what if we don't want the same padding on the four sides? So we want different padding. So if we want to remove this, I'm just commenting this, and we can write this as padding top of 20 pixel, padding bottom of 20 pixel, padding left be 40 pixel, padding right is the 40 pixel. So if I save this, you can see on top and bottom it is 20 and the side will be 40. Instead of writing all four properties, we can simply write shorthand. I'm just commenting this, and I'm adding a shorthand. Pixel space and 40 pixel. So there would be nothing much change, but is a shorthand. Now let's move on to the second important property, margin. Remember the basic difference between padding and margin. Padding creates space inside the element. Margin creates space outside an element. So if we want to create space between elements, margin is usually what we want. So let's look at our list. The list of items. The list items are currently very close together. So let's add some space between them. We already have an li selector here down. Okay, in here. This I'm giving a margin bottom 10 pixels. So if I refresh this, you can see the difference. You can see the margin bottom be 10 pixels, and each list item has then 10 pixels of space below it. But there is a small problem. Look at the last list. We really don't want any space in here, and there is a text here, so I'm just removing the text. Okay, So actually we don't want any space between the last element. We only want space between the items. So we can use something we already learned, that is last child, the pseudo class. And here we can give margin bottom to 0. As you can see, there won't be any space here. It is 0. This means the selected li elements that is in the last child and then set it bottom margin to 0. As the value is 0, we don't need to specify any unit like pixels or percentage. Now let's take a look at the entire page. We can already see quite a lot of spaces around our elements. For example, here in H2, there is a space around there, the space between the paragraphs. And the headings such as H1 already have default margins. Where are these spaces coming from? Well, they are coming from the browser's default styles. Browsers automatically add some margin and padding to many HTML elements. And while these defaults can sometimes be useful, they can also make it harder for us to completely control our design. So what we want to do is remove these default margins and paddings. This is called a global reset. Before creating our reset, you might wonder, we can simply put our body as margin 0. As you can see, we have every element loses its margin. Everything is now closer to the edge of the viewport. But notice something important. The other elements still have their own margins. So this approach don't give or solve our problems. And that's because margin and padding are not inherited properties. The margin of the parent does not automatically get passed down to its children. So we need another solution. This is where the universal selector becomes useful. So we simply copy this and the universal selector, I'm keeping margin 0 and padding also to 0. And if I save this, and now we removed our default margin and padding from every element. This is exactly what we want. Our page now has no unnecessary browsing spacings. We are completely free to add our own spacings. And then we can deliberately decide how much space each element should have. This gives us much more control over the design. Now don't worry about the padding we already added to our header. Our header still has its padding because our main header selector is more specific than the universal selector. Now that our global reset is in place, let's continue adding our custom spacing. Let's look at our aside element. It has a background color, so this is another perfect candidate for padding. Right now the content is very close to the edges, so let's add padding top, be 50 pixels, and padding bottom 50 pixels. We have much more breathing room above and below the content, and we can make this code shorter by using the shorthand. That is nothing but padding 50 pixels space 0. So exactly what we wanted. Let's move back to the top of our page. We need some space between the main header and the H2 below it. So the space is outside the header. So we should use margin, not padding. So inside the main header, we have to give margin bottom of 60 pixels. And now you notice a nice amount of space between the header and the heading. When you are creating vertical spaces between elements, I personally recommend using margin bottom consistently. You could use margin top instead, but mixing both approaches everywhere can make your CSS harder to reason about. So choosing one consistent approach is often much easier. Now next, add some space below the H2. Now H2, margin bottom to 30 pixels. And now there's some breathing room between the heading and the content underneath it. These values are somewhat attribute for now. These values somewhat a close match for now. Later, we can create a spacing system that we don't have to randomly choose values like 20, 30 or 60. Let's look at this section containing the image, author information and other content. This is our post header. So we don't have any. So let's just create the class here. This is our main header and this is our post header. So in here we create the class post header. So I'm just placing it below the main header. I'm creating a margin bottom of 40 pixels. Now we have some additional space between the post header and the content below it. Now let's look at our paragraph. Right now they look quite crowded. We can improve this simply by adding some margins at the bottom. So let's go for the paragraph. Okay. And here we just add margin bottom of 15 pixels. This is a good example of how a small amount of spacing can make a big difference to overall design. Now let's look at our ordered and unordered list here. The list markers are positioned outside a normal content area, so we need to add some space onto the left. So just create ordered. In that we'll create margin left of 50 pixels. Okay. Now the numbers and the bullet points are visible again. We can also add some space below this. So I'm just adding margin bottom of 20 pixels. Okay. It's much better. Now let's work with our H3 heading. Let's also add some space above it. We can add margin top 40 pixels. Finally, let's create some space between our articles. So let's create an article at the top actually after the post header. Just creating article. That I'm giving a margin bottom of 60 pixels. Now we have a nice amount of space separating those sections and our page looks much organized. So that's it for today's. In the next lecture, we'll continue working with the box model and start adding dimensions including the heights and the widths.